Style over substance. One of the 3 core tenets of Cyberpunk, as laid out by the series' origins as a pen and paper RPG. But it's a philosophy that Cyberpunk 2077 may have taken a little too literally. With big promises spurred by lofty ambitions and wrapped in a cool neon veneer, Cyberpunk became one of the most anticipated titles of the last decade, until it finally arrived and became one of the most derided. Many players criticise the lack of both style and substance upon release, often taking extreme stances that channeled the other 2 themes of Cyberpunk. Attitude is everything, and live on the edge. Ooh. That attitude was usually aggressively negative, and some of the hot takes were edgier than Elon Musk's Cybertruck. Now, well over a month after Cyberpunk 2077 landed on our laps, fried our old consoles, and swamped our news feeds with glitch videos, it might be time to just take a deep breath and have a measured look at what actually happened. Despite what developer CD Projekt Red had us believe, Cyberpunk 2077 was not the second coming of Christ. It won't make you smarter, funnier, more charming, or better in bed. It won't pay off your student debt, or make you a millionaire, or transcend you to godhood. It's just a game. Still a very good game, it should be said, but one with many flaws and many angles to cover. And we're going to try to evaluate Cyberpunk 2077 in as balanced a way as possible. I know, crazy idea, but it might just work. Now, for the record, I personally enjoyed this game on the whole. I've sunk over 100 hours into this game across 1.5 playthroughs and most of the side content. You know, because credentials are important for these kinds of videos. I've played the game since release, but on the Xbox Series X, so I'm lucky enough to have avoided the mess on previous gen consoles. But I'm not blind to the game's issues either. Yes, there are bugs. And yes, the game lacks a lot of depth it promised in pre-release marketing. We'll get into all of this soon enough, but naturally, these are just one person's opinions, and opinions are subjective. You know, because clarifying this is important for these kinds of videos. Additionally, we'll be covering the circumstances surrounding this high-profile title, because context is everything. Like the in-game cyberware that fuses metal to flesh, it's impossible to completely separate Cyberpunk the game from Cyberpunk the controversy. This video will be roughly split into 2 halves. Firstly, covering the build-up, development and troubled release, then analysing the game itself, its good points, bad points, and missing features. Finally, like a disappointing chili, spoilers will be mild at best. Most of the video will avoid spoilers as much as possible, but check the timestamps in the description or the chapter markers where the mild spoiler territory will be clearly marked. Okay, let's get on with it, shall we? In an ideal world, we'd be able to look at Cyberpunk the game as a completely separate entity from Cyberpunk the 8-year hype phenomenon. But life is rarely that simple, and much like the time I lost my trousers in a Domino's pizza store, context is important. So here's a rundown of how we got to this point. In 2012, CD Projekt Red first announced at their summer conference a new game based on the world of Cyberpunk, the pen and paper RPG created by Mike Pondsmith. Interestingly, this would only be the second officially licensed Cyberpunk title, after the 2007 Java-based mobile platformer Cyberpunk Arasaka's Plot. The Cyberpunk genre, with its dystopian near-future themes of style over substance, high-tech, low-life, and transhumanism, was huge in the 80s and 90s, but it had long laid dormant in mainstream media by 2012. Well, barring 1 or 2 exceptions.
I never asked for this.
Even this early on, CDPR had big ambitions to revive this genre for what was still a low-key studio. A mature, advanced RPG with a non-linear story and a huge arsenal of high-tech toys that aimed to set a new standard in gaming. Now obviously hindsight is 2020, and we're not judging them at all at this point. I mean, it's good to shoot for the stars when you start a project, right? 2013 was when the game appeared on most of our radars, with that slick, mysterious CG trailer serving as a powerful mood board of what Cyberpunk would become, along with a poorly aged closing statement, coming when it's ready. Details went dark for a while as CDPR were busy becoming critical darlings with the release of The Witcher 3 in 2015.
We have arrived. The major leagues.
It's understood work on Cyberpunk began properly around 2016, and only in 2018 did we start to get the real juicy deets, with an E3 trailer and later on a 48-minute gameplay demo that had the hype train well and truly rolling. This hype reached critical mass with the breathtaking big money signing of Keanu Reeves in 2019. And from there, a continual drip feed of details and promises. Fast forward a bit, 2020 kicks normality firmly in the knackers, and the game is pushed back 3 times in total from the 16th of April all the way to the 10th of December, instilling an irrational fear of the colour yellow in the process. But finally, the most anticipated game of recent times was released into the wild. And the resulting masterpiece was so good, it instantly wiped out COVID, solved world hunger, and brought about a new age of enlightenment. Hooray! The end. Well, not quite. So, in the biggest plot twist of 2020, Cyberpunk 2077 wasn't actually the perfect game. It was certainly all anyone could talk about, just for all the wrong reasons. The staggering number of glitches only tell part of the story, but the internet being what it is, there was an endless stream of memes and montages, so let's just get those out of the way now. Now, fail compilations can be a lot of fun, but it's worth remembering that montages like this, which stick together all the worst bits back to back, can easily skew perceptions of an average gameplay session. Luckily, playing on a next-gen console, my experience wasn't nearly as bad as the media portrayal, but minor bugs were still a frequent backdrop, chipping away at immersion and patience. I had about half a dozen crashes total, over 100 plus hours, but not everybody was that fortunate. Among the worst issues reported were broken quests, animation glitches ruining emotional story points, save games corrupting if the file size exceeded an 8MB limit caused by interacting with too many items or, playing the damn game too much, and by far the worst problem were of course the horrendous performance issues on the base PS4 and Xbox One consoles, which simply couldn't handle the game. Textures would often struggle to load properly, and you'd be lucky if you got 20 frames per second or more than 20 minutes without a crash. To any smug idiots who ever said, "Oh well, that's what you get for running a next-gen game on 7-year-old hardware," here's a reminder that the title isn't next-gen. Console versions were explicitly sold as PS4 and Xbox One versions. The bare minimum requirement was that they run on these consoles, and in many cases, they simply couldn't. Some credit goes to CDPR for offering refunds, but it's faint praise. They offered amends for a problem of their own causing, after the problem grew too big to ignore, and they still made a hash of things not clearing with retailers and online stores prior. The game was later removed entirely from the PlayStation Store, which was an unprecedented move from Sony, while Microsoft added a clear warning of performance issues on their page, and both companies offered refunds, no questions asked. But bugs and technical failures aren't the only sins that CDPR have committed. And we're still not talking about the game itself yet. Sorry, we'll get to it properly soon, I promise. Beyond the funny memes and glitch compilations, it became clear that something wasn't right at CD Projekt Red. Up until days before release, Cyberpunk was the hottest property in gaming, to the point that some so-called fans would deny any criticism of a game that they hadn't even played yet, even attacking reviewers who had the gall to have an epileptic fit while playing certain sequences. And yet, within days, sentiment had turned completely on the company once hailed as being pro-consumer. Negative reviews for the subpar versions came flooding in, widespread refunds were issued, CD Projekt's shares dropped 30%, several lawsuits were filed from investors, and even the Polish government started investigating the company. Upper management was heavily criticised for rushing the game out of the door in time for peak holiday sales, and now, well over a month after release, we've seen an official apology from CDPR, along with a pretty damning report from Bloomberg's Jason Schreier, confirming what we had expected all along. Disorganisation, chaotic creative direction, misplaced priorities on marketing rather than development, and of course, crunch. Staff powered through months and in some cases years of long, mandatory working hours, despite multiple promises made by CDPR to the public and to Schreier himself that crunch would be avoided. Even when it wasn't technically mandatory, workers apparently felt pressured to put in extra hours by managers or co-workers. Many employees thought the release date of 2020 was a joke, expecting development to take another 2 years at least. And during a post-launch internal meeting with management, one staff member even rightfully pointed out the hypocrisy of using severe crunch tactics to make a game that was all about demonizing soulless corporate exploitation. CDPR are far from the only developers guilty of crunch. It's a depressingly common practice that's plagued the industry for decades. But they shot themselves in the foot repeatedly by playing up to the PR image of being the good guys. The company's co-founder, Marcin Iwinski, recently appeared in an apology video, taking ownership of the mistakes in a somber tone we'd like to believe was sincere, but still managed to put his bullet-ridden foot in it when he accidentally blamed the QA team for missing the majority of bugs. You really think that these underpaid, overworked testers missed the hundreds of glaring issues? Or did the devs simply run out of time to fix them because you had to get the game out under as many Christmas trees as possible? Much less graceful was the response from another company bigwig, studio head Adam Badowski, who responded in poor taste to a few selective points made in Schreier's article, arrogantly pointing to high review scores for justification and leaning heavily on the work in progress watermark to excuse missing features. Not a single word about crunch though. It's unclear how long the crunch period actually lasted, but there was a high turnover rate of key staff throughout this project's long development. And in 2017, it was notable that several former employees left negative reviews of CDPR on the website Glassdoor. The slick presentation of so much pre-release marketing couldn't have been further from the troubled reality of development. But this video isn't just a hit piece, and there is a silver lining. Despite poor decisions from the very top, it's clear the hundreds of regular employees at CDPR performed above and beyond to ship this game at all, even with its notable issues. They simply needed more time. And while the post-launch rhetoric reeks of
"We're sorry. We're sorry. Sorry,"
at least they vaguely committed to a roadmap of future fixes, updates, and improvements. And apparently all without crunch. Hey, let's hope they mean that this time. Well, now that's been covered, shall we talk about the game? You know, the thing hidden underneath this big pile of controversy. This might surprise anyone who's been on the internet recently, but this much maligned video game is actually pretty good. Okay, so it might have one or two flaws. Understatement of the century. But when it works, it's quite superb. Obviously, we're in highly subjective territory here, and it's okay to disagree, but just hear us out before you start typing furiously in the comments. So, what does Cyberpunk do right? Well, let's start with the story, which, as you'd expect given their pedigree with The Witcher, is wonderfully written with an excellent supporting cast. Quick reminder, we're still avoiding major spoilers here, but if you want to be safe and avoid all hints whatsoever, check the timestamps to skip ahead. The main story may begin as a simple rags to riches tale, but it quickly evolves into something much more unique. We'll cover the downsides of this approach later, but what we did get was an incredibly gripping narrative with several interesting themes, the core one being identity. Mainly, how far some people will go to change, or desperately cling on to said identity, in a hostile city obsessed with superficial cosmetics and material gains. The detailed lore and history of Night City is set up nicely. It introduces the key players and concepts in slick ways. In the first few hours alone, you'll see the heavily armed Doctors of Trauma Team and the Max Tac Special Forces. You'll see the normalization of cyberware through Ripper Docs, the importance of fixers in this world, and of course the countless dangers from unstable street gangs to the terrifying dominance of mega corporations like Arasaka and Militech. Many major characters feel truly fleshed out with their own believable backgrounds, quirks and motivations, and in some cases they have their own really detailed side quests with some excellent story arcs. You really want to experience some of these side quests. Naturally, our breathtaking rocker boy Johnny Silverhand plays a starring role in this stellar cast. The circumstances around his introduction make for a unique dynamic, and it's explored masterfully over the course of the game, not just in serious main story beats, but also in various side quests, as he pops up to deliver his cynical takes on this absolute dive of a city. He is, objectively, an absolute dick. He's a selfish, narcissistic old rock star, with deeply ingrained anti-corpo beliefs and a ruthless, violent streak. And yet, rarely can you ever hate him for it, such as the quality of writing. Same goes for voice acting. Keanu captures that world-weary rocker vibe very well, and so many of the other cast are similarly well voiced. The game may not handle choice too well throughout most of the storyline, but the multiple endings, each with their separate missions, all feel satisfying in their own way, even the ones that aren't your typical happily ever after. Some of the animations for these major characters are also pretty fantastic, when they're not deposing or levitating chopsticks of course. Subtle little touches like Jackie's nervous leg bounce, or Evelyn's numerous femme fatale nuances, or in the case of one creepy back alley Ripperdoc, the unsettling moisturizer bottle.
The marks? Why didn't you say so?
Don't forget to sanitize your hands. Onto the non-story side missions, the gigs dotted around the city are probably the best example of Cyberpunk's flexible approach to gameplay. How these are initially presented to you leaves a lot to be desired, but most of these areas are well-designed mini-levels, offering a variety of silent or non-silent ways to complete your objective to fit in with different character builds and playstyles. It helps that combat, and especially gunplay, is a lot of fun, which is impressive given this is new territory for CDPR. Weapons feel satisfying to shoot, and the different weapon types add new dynamics to every fight, allowing you to ricochet shots off of surfaces, lock onto enemies, or shoot through walls. Melee is a bit more basic, but it still offers some control with dodging, counters, and power attacks. And the quick hacks are magnificent. They essentially fill the role of techno magic. They can complement stealthy play or assist you in full-on assaults, and at higher levels you can wipe out entire squads with one click, or turn an enemy into a dangerous cyber psycho and, get them to do all the work for you. Spec heavily into intelligence and you can be a hacker god. A bit like Boris from GoldenEye if Boris had more metal in his face.
Yes! I am invincible!
Please welcome Keanu Reeves.
The leveling system offers plenty of options as well, for a frankly ludicrous amount of perks. These vary largely in quality and effectiveness, but still, your choices in build variety are impressive, and probably the main draw for repeat playthroughs at this time. Night City, at least on a surface level, looks spectacular. The art direction and world design is awe-inspiring. Just walking through some of the bustling markets or dingy side alleys or crisp corporate zone streets, and looking up to be surrounded by towering monuments to extreme excess or abject poverty. These moments are genuinely, dare I say it, breathtaking? The level design takes plenty of opportunities to show this off with clever visual framing during a lot of quest moments. And then there's the music. The in-game OST hits just right, with the expected mix of dirty synth bass lines intermingled with some surprisingly haunting string pieces. The licensed music nails the vibe perfectly too, with a range of absolute bangers across many different genres, from EDM to synth pop to hip hop, industrial rock and screamo metal. And the real-life band, Refused, did a brilliant job of essentially becoming Johnny's band Samurai. At the end of the day, there is a lot to like with Cyberpunk, and had it not come with the heavy burden of expectation, it might still have blown people away, but, well, context is everything. Night City, a bustling concrete jungle of crime and chrome, built on the backs of broken neon dreams. But the worst of Night City lurks just below the surface. Take a look. Oh, you can't see anything? Exactly. There's very little beneath this pretty exterior, because the biggest crime in this city is its lack of depth and unfulfilled potential. Let's start with the main story once more. Again, we won't talk specifics, but minor spoiler warning, check the timestamps to skip ahead if you wish. Despite the excellent story already in place, it's hard to deny the disappointment in not having a more typical rags to riches structure, more standard with RPGs built around characters of your own creation. You can't carve your own path through Night City, instead, you're stuck on the path CDPR has laid out for you. The lack of branching quest lines and meaningful consequences make forging a narrative unique to your character nearly impossible, as every story playthrough is largely the same. Many modern RPGs have failed to deliver on this front, and Cyberpunk is no different. Then there's the pacing. Taken in isolation, start to finish, it's exhilarating. But from Act 2, when the game opens up, you're given a strict deadline, at least from the storyline perspective, of only a few weeks, making any side activity seem obsolete from your character's point of view. They could have solved this easily by making the perceived time limit just a bit more vague in order to clear the conscience of any side quest hungry players. There's growing evidence to suggest that it was the high profile inclusion of Keanu Reeves that led to a complete rework of the main story arc as late as 2019. This would certainly explain the frankly insulting 6-month montage that we're shown near the very beginning of the game. So many people expected this rise up the ranks of Night City to be the bulk of the experience, not reduced to a few minutes of cutscene footage. Next up, the side missions. As mentioned, the gigs are mostly entertaining sections of gameplay, but how they're presented through the fixers is a massive disservice to those missions. Having a fixer ring you as soon as you enter their district, then every single time you get close to a side gig, can easily push players away from some pretty fun content after all this cold caller spam. And given how important fixers are meant to be in Night City, most of them have little personality and leave zero impression. At the very least, maybe let us call them whenever we're looking for another gig, in order to give a bit more control back to the player. NCPD crime spots, while performing their base function as simple busy work, could easily have their icons removed from the map entirely, freeing up the clutter and making them feel more like natural, emergent events in the world. Finally, on the story points, the life paths. They are woefully underutilized considering the pre-release hype and their emphasis in the tabletop game. Half an hour of unique prologue content, and then your cool backstory is nothing more than a few dialogue options that only ever provide flavor text. There's nothing wrong with that, But give us a few chances to make meaningful choices and influence the quests, please. Now for Night City itself. The biggest disappointment for so many who were expecting an in-depth, immersive RPG experience was the lack of interactivity and believability of the game world itself. Many of these are minor quibbles admittedly, but their absence amounts to death by 1,000 cuts as far as immersion is concerned. It's the lack of silly minigames, no freeform crime system that allow you to do things like robbing stores, pointless NPC one-liners, most market stalls being window dressing, most doors being locked entirely, no previewing of clothes before purchase, no way to change your hair or facial features whatsoever, in a setting literally themed around changing your looks on a whim. There's more, but you get the point. One feature that's surprisingly underbaked, given the sky-high crime rates of Night City, are the police AI. Cause too much of a ruckus, you little scallywag, and the NCPD will magically spawn in directly behind you. But don't worry, they won't give chase, because organic vehicle chases haven't been implemented. Speaking of AI, the crowd NPCs are barely functioning examples of humans. Sure, we don't expect fully fledged radiant AI with complex schedules because, frankly, that would be overkill. But ideally, we'd at least like NPCs to know how to drive around obstacles or run away properly when they're scared. But at least they're good at hiding, you know, when they phase right through walls. Here's a few more quick-fire issues. Stealth is fairly basic outside of quick hacks, and sometimes enemies can spot you right through walls, even if you've phased into them. Sorry, big fella. Cyberware is cool and everything, but it isn't pushed enough as a feature, and it lacks the grandeur of that first time at the Ripper Docks. You might as well be buying your groceries from this menu instead of gnarly mantis blades. The loot system is entirely too much, leading to a lot of busy work when sorting your inventory, and having to wrestle with a not great UI to begin with. The constant, incremental upgrades in all your item stats discourages you from sticking with your favourite weapons too long, and this system outright punishes you for picking outfit choices that match your intended style, when usually equipping the best armor ratings makes you look like you fell into a lost and found bin. Weapon customization is limited, and likewise, vehicle customization doesn't exist at all. Crafting isn't elaborated on at all, and while serviceable, it's far from interesting, much like my opinions. Street Cred only unlocks new side gigs and items, but it doesn't have a real impact in a wider game. Street gangs are interesting, but many don't get enough of a spotlight. Here's hoping for a faction influence system, or maybe even dedicated quest lines somewhere in the future. I could go on a lot more, but you get the gist. So, how much of this is realistically fixable? Finer details would be simple to add, at least in theory, but these things all add up. Messing around with the crowd and police AI could get a lot trickier, and it's not exactly a glamorous upgrade that they can brag about. As for adding in quest lines that flesh out the life path prologues, or street gangs, or fixers, they all sound like major DLC territory. And expecting CDPR to chop up huge parts of the story arc just to add in a few more choices for us is such a complex task that we fear it'll forever be just a pipe dream. It might seem like we're asking a lot, but really, the lack of restraint from CD Projekt Red's marketing team has directly led to these sky-high expectations.
It's one of those places where expectations and reality collide, resulting in a heap of disappointment.
A major turning point in Cyberpunk's pre-release story was the extended 48-minute gameplay demo revealed in 2018, which made a lot of promises and really kicked the hype into overdrive. A gameplay demo that we now know was almost completely fake. Schreier's report revealed that developers spent months building this impressive demo from the ground up, before many of the systems shown were even implemented properly into the engine. In fairness, this is common practice in the games industry, to spend a lot of time building a working vertical slice of the ideal final product, only later building out the features promised within. It might look pretty and polished from the front, but it's barely held together with sticky tape and wishful thinking. Things understandably change a lot during the manic development process, hence the work in progress watermark used in this demo and many others. But CDPR should still be held accountable for the many promises, some of which were still being made right up until the final months before release. If we look at all the features missing from just that 2018 demo, it only gets more depressing. Deep customization options with detailed backstories? Gone. Third-person cutscenes? Gone. Wall climbing with mantis blades? Gone. Breakable walls? Gone.
Fluffy ruffs.
Gone. Item stats that affect street cred? Gone. Clearly displayed enemy levels? Gone. Purchasing cyberware presented in-game rather than on a static menu? Gone. Your friendly neighborhood spider bot companion? Well, I suppose you could say is gone. For fear of being a bit too nitpicky, we'll add that plenty of aspects were maintained in the end product. Details like double jumps, quick hacks, vending machines, stealth takedowns, dialogue choices, weapon types, all of these were either retained, improved, or only changed slightly. The bulk of the missions shown in the demo also play out in a similar fashion, but a number of inaccuracies shown here make for some very poorly aged comments from our announcer friend.
So many options, so many possibilities, and each will have consequences that will ripple through the game world and your story.
No, they won't.
And that's just one quest.
Exactly, just one quest.
Random encounters like these are an example of how your actions directly influence your open world experience.
Literally not in the game. All car chases are scripted events.
We've greatly enhanced our crowd and community system.
No, you haven't.
It will let you explore a variety of different interactions with the game world. And as you just saw, it's people.
Yeah, no.
This is an RPG.
Well, that is an interesting statement, Samurai. Let's dive a little deeper into that, shall we? As time goes on and patches start to fix the bugs that received so much attention at launch, the scrutiny of Cyberpunk 2077 has moved on to its deeper inherent flaws. And amongst those, one big question has cropped up more and more. Is this game actually an RPG? Despite all of the knee-jerk, extreme reactions across the internet, the real answer is... it depends. What is your definition of a role-playing video game? The term role-playing is used very loosely in modern gaming. Some people even call the recent Assassin's Creed games RPGs, which is frankly mental, even if it does have a few RPG elements to it. So then it depends on what aspects of an RPG are important to you. Do you like a lot of numbers attached to characters and items, allowing for different builds? Well, that could cover anything from Baldur's Gate to Borderlands. Do you like good old-fashioned turn-based combat like in Final Fantasy or even Pokemon? Is the story most important, and its amount of meaningful choices and consequences, like with The Witcher 3 or Mass Effect? Well, sometimes. What about dialogue choices that match your build, or dynamic faction reputations, like everyone's favourite Fallout New Vegas? How about a world that feels truly immersive, down to the silly little things that you can do to play your role, like in Red Dead Redemption 2 for example? Okay, not a traditional RPG, but the world sure does pull you in. Or maybe, just maybe, you're a tabletop RPG purist that scoffs at the limits that video games by their very nature place on your unlimited imagination. It seems like Cyberpunk wanted to be all of these things. And despite their huge ambition, the creators discovered that you can't please everyone. In terms of pure gameplay factors, I'd say Cyberpunk succeeds in being an RPG, at least more often than not. You could approach most of the side quests and even some main missions in different ways thanks to the level design. You can go pure stealth, take out enemies with silenced pistols, use skills to find different paths, hack turrets and mines, hack enemies to turn on each other, go loud with fists or melee weapons, bring out the big guns, zip around with slick, slow motion kills, or snipe enemies from afar. You have options, and options are important. But as for playing a proper role in this story, a character defined by your own actions, choice and consequence rarely matter, so from a storyline perspective, Cyberpunk fails the RPG test. And from an immersion standpoint, the lack of extracurricular activities, and even minor actions like sitting down whenever you want, means that Cyberpunk fails as an immersive sim too. And sadly, despite all of the best wishes in the world, all the ambition, all the cool visual nods and lore details and awesome plot points, this game rarely lives up to the RPG roots set by Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk 2020. We've attempted to be as fair as possible, covering every aspect of Cyberpunk 2077's long and complicated saga. Not just the game itself, but the surrounding drama as well, because for better or worse, it's impossible to separate them. Is Cyberpunk 2077 still a good game? Hell, maybe even a great game? Absolutely. There's plenty to love about this, just so long as you go in with tempered expectations. The main story is wonderfully compelling, but largely linear. The combat is entertaining, if a little bit rough around the edges. The characters are incredibly well written, and the world is brimming with stunning atmosphere. Just for the love of Johnny, don't look beneath the surface. Could this have been one of the greatest games of all time? Possibly, but not without a couple of extra years in the oven. There's still hope on the distant horizon. Patches have already eliminated the worst bugs, and CD Projekt Red have stated their commitment to improving the game without crippling their workforce through crunch. Whether you still believe them is another matter, but maybe one day Cyberpunk will live up to its potential. In the end, Cyberpunk 2077 has been a cautionary tale of lofty ambitions and broken promises, of spectacular highs, disappointing lows, and frustratingly squandered potential. And it's what happens when your cyberpunk mantra of style over substance goes a bit too far. To everyone patient enough to have sat through my not so dulcet tones this far in, thank you so much. If you've yet to play Cyberpunk and aren't sold enough on the setting or story to overlook its shortcomings, then you know the drill. Wait 6 months, maybe even a year, then check back in. And if you have played it, I'd love to know your thoughts, so please do let us know in the comments below. And of course, thanks for watching.